If you didn't know it, by the way, the department is having a Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, thank you. Would you please talk about Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, whatever. Whatever you
So we're
want.
having our faculty party next week, Wednesday from 12 to 3:30 in the Hall of Languages. If you want to bring food, please do, and you won't be charged. If you don't want to bring food, bring cash. Because this is I'm sorry, but this is to raise money for like the CGAT organization.
$5.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not exactly. That begins at what time again?
12 o'clock.
12 o'clock and goes till
3:30.
3:30.
And the celebration of student writing starts from 3 to 5 in Student Center.
Yeah, so if you want to meet some folks, come on out. It's going to be some really good food. I know that it's going to be brisket, pork loin, ziti, chili.
I'm bringing a pumpkin cake and some pies.
I'm probably going to bring some kind of Danish something that I whip up. And then side dishes, plenty of side dishes. So we hope you can make it. It'll be lovely. And you will get filled up to the brim with some seriously good food. Okay, how's our little one, Shay?
He's fussy today, so I went ahead and did the voiceover on my presentation because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it.
Okay, very good. I saw that he was having some issues today.
Yeah, he's
And
been
hi,
very
Jill.
Well, first I want to give a shout out to all my people, my homies out there on digital TV. I know where you are. I know where you're coming from, and I'm representing y'all today. All right, so I'm bringing it. You know, I thought about maybe doing a presentation, a long, boring presentation over the internet for you guys, and it dawned on me that I don't have to give a long, boring presentation over the internet. I can do that and have the same results here in person. I chose my topic, acting out violence and rage in reaction to racism in young adult literature. You know, I feel like we went through, you know, we saw a lot of instances of that, or a lot of and we had conversations about our authors going through and trying to position the main characters in such a manner where the audience or the readers understood where that rage was coming from, or where that violence was coming from, and was it justified, not justified. And I wanted to dig a little bit into that. And so I, through my research, it took me a little while to get there, though. As I'm going through and I'm scrolling to see what some of those topics are, what am I running across? What you guys know how it is. So you're doing the research, and this article will pop up about, that's not what I'm looking for, and then this isn't what I'm looking for. These things kept coming over and over again: the bullying, dating violence, and rape. If I ever wanted to do any research over dating violence in literature, it is that there is a ton of articles out there about that. But for what it was that I was looking for, I couldn't find much. So I think I probably maxed out about for this class length of what I can do. So having said that, that's how I narrowed it down, and what some of the things that I ran across as I was looking. As I started going through there and actually writing my paper, I'm actually glad that I got to do this after my paper was submitted, so that I had a little more time to digest it a little bit and kind of go from there. I ran across this. This is a letter from Wendell Phillips to Frederick Douglass, 1845. And this little quote in this letter resonated with me, and I'll go on and explain it a little bit. He says, "My dear friend, you remember the old fable of the man and the lion, where the lion complained that he should not be so misrepresented when the lions wrote history. I'm glad the time has come when the lions write history." And I think from what we know about, our Black history, that we start off with folks like Frederick Douglass, The Narrative Life of Frederick Douglass. That's really one of the first snapshots. And then as we go through from then until now, that those doors, they just keep opening and opening more and more of I guess, of the insight of those folks that are writing. It makes it clear to folks that aren't living it, like me and you guys, of what they go through and kind of how to emphasize a little bit better with them. And so this resonated with me as we went through there. So part one, I have 4 parts. Part one, the early interpretations of Black rage in young adult literature. And what you see over here, you see Richard Wright. He wrote The Native Son in 1940, and in his Native Son, it's really he's writing about a 20-year-old, so it's kind of this early submission to how a young man interacts with his surroundings, and how the frustrations that he feels, and how the author shows some kind of justification as to why he acts in the way he does, and tries to get you to gain empathy for his violent actions. And so he does this, and he writes this in 1940 about the young man in the 1930s who really is kind of representing him. And as he goes through, it talks about all these folks all these African American citizens are leaving the strong South because of all the prejudice, racism, and oppression that's there. And they go to places like Chicago, which is where this is. And as they're there, they go from one hot mess to another hot mess. And so he ends up writing about all the frustrations and struggles that he sees there, and the violence that starts and really takes control of his life as a result of that. Excuse me. The articles that I reached out to in this are Boys in the Hood, Black Male Community in Richard Wright's Native Son, and Black Boy No More, Violence and the Flight from Blackness in Richard Wright's Native Son. Excuse me. And then the Monster Sacks, Problematizing Violence in Young Adult Literature, really gave me the emphasis of what to look for, the definition of violence as we go through. So what kind of the process that I saw was, I start with a quote from Frederick Douglass and the letter, and go from there. And then as we move from there, I really think that narrative that the gentleman spoke about in that letter, about the voice being, having more and more voice, how the line gets to narrate his, same thing with our African-American citizens. So there's a little bit of voice then when he writes, and it's able to get out a little bit more. There's a little bit more voice here when he writes in 1940. There's a little bit more voice when we get to the civil rights era, and then you see more and more justification of the violence, empathizing with the violence, more and more, I guess, a picture into why folks react violently, and so on and so forth. And then by the time we get to the Black Lives Matter movement, it's wide open, and there's just a ton of literature. So I see it as like a snowball that starts off really slow, and as it gains momentum, by the time it gets to the Black Lives Matter, it's just so much literature out there. So that's kind of what my thought process was in dividing it. Part two, I talked about the marketing, the violence, and the effects of violence on the Black community. Well, in the 1980s, the Federal Communications Commission went through and they deregulated the children's television and films, and that had a result on not just television and film, but it had on commercials and literature and all kinds of toys, everything with the kiddos. And Diane Levin and Nancy Carlson, they go through and they talk about how this especially affected children of color, how they constantly see all this, as they're growing and trying to identify themselves. Before they were able to identify really on television when they watched TV and all these things, even though it was a white vision, a white world that they were watching, it was watered down. But after that, violence just starts pouring into the kiddos, and as they're reaching to try to identify themselves, a lot of the racism and stereotypes are also being bombarded, and so that division, that violence is attributed to black kids or black young adults. And when that happens, not only does it go through in the television world and in the film world, but also goes through into the literature. And so you see a lot of it there. And then another person to speak about this is you are a flaw in the pattern, difference, autonomy, and bullying in young adult fiction by Lopez Ropero. On this, they really talk about bullying, but she goes through and she talks about the susceptibility of the youth whenever they see all this violence that continues to flow into their lives through all this. But she does mention also about racist bullying, and I thought that was fitting for this paper, this presentation. Part 3, I talked to you if you take the analogy of the snowball, and when we get to this part, it kind of is more wide open. Part 3 is the Black Lives Matters, and sometimes violent strategies do too. And then, of course, you see, these are you guys know we read these 2 stories here, but the authors of those particular books. This is the literature that I looked through, and the articles, the top 2 articles that gave me some pretty good information as I was reading. Nobody's Protest, Novelistic Strategies of the Black Lives Matter Movement by Vincent Haddad. I thought he did a really good job of saying that once the Black Lives Matter movement, really took a hold in mainstream America, whether you were for it or against it, it doesn't matter. Once it took hold and people understood what it was, that these authors would then take their narrative and fit it to these strategies that continued and enlightened more people on, what that looked like. And The Hate U Give was really one of the first examples of that. And then, of course, we see it, The Rock and the River, where you have, and in Dear Martin, where you have the police officer that does, is unfair. They wrongfully do things. They shoot those black youths, and then from that, here's the response, and here's how they react, and here's why they get mad, and why they're full of rage, and why they're violent. And as readers, that's what he talks about, these novelistic strategies. It lets the readers gain some of that justification. Well, I understand now if that really happened, if that's how it happened. If they're saying that this is what happened here, well, it makes sense to me why they got upset and so on. So they use this movement to show the violence and the frustration. And then finally, part 4, other plights of violence and reaction to racism. Certainly, a lot of the things that we read were about African Americans, but they're not alone into it. We had several instances of it. One of the articles I read, Not Another Dead Indian, Young Adult Fiction, Survivance and Sherman Alexi's Flight, talking about the Native Americans and why they were full of rage and why they acted out because of the frustrations that they had. Esperanza Rising, you guys remember that story that we read in this class. You remember what was Esperanza's boyfriend, Miguel? Remember how she wanted him to do something whenever the guy, whenever he got, he lost his mechanic job. And she didn't understand why he just sat there, why he didn't do something about it. And then, obviously, the Revolution of Evelyn Serrano And for that point where you see the Hispanic, I can't think of their name now, whatever the Hispanic, the young lords, thank you. So, so you see, it's not just our African Americans in the story. So this theme that we read I saw it filter through almost all of our works this year, and so, or this semester, and so that's what I picked. In our last closing thoughts here. You know, I'll say that this morning, I'm sure you guys felt the same way. When I woke up, there was frost on the ground, and there was frost on the windshield and on your cars. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? You woke up to the same thing. Well, in the same manner that the sun warmed that, in the same manner that the sun warmed that and made this a beautiful day, so too did my knowledge of coming here and seeing Dr. Stewart in person warm my heart. I will field questions if you guys have any.
Hey. Congratulations.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
I did mine. I named it Living in the Periphery. I talked about the marginalized adolescent and invisibility. So I separated mine in 4 chapters based on marginalization. So gender and sexuality, race, disability, and then I dedicated a chapter to intersectionalities. My introduction situates my collection. I discuss ideology, narration as a vehicle for ideology, and then power and repression, and invisibility as it relates to marginalization. Chapter 1, the articles that I chose here, the first one, the nice cape, super, I don't like that word, so I'm not going to say it. It talks about male identity crises because of hegemonic masculinity. And
Tell me, Jennifer, how many times did you think you would ever get to say hegemonic masculinity? People would know what you were saying.
right.
Sorry.
Well, I was telling my coworker about my presentation, and I was laughing that only in this class could I include an article about female masturbation, and we would all laugh about it. So the first article, it was an interesting inclusion because they focus on graphic novels in the genre. So the title comes from a graphic novel, Tales from the Farm, and the main character is dealing with his trauma of losing his mother, and so the way he deals with that is he turns to superheroes and comic books, and he starts wearing a mask and a cape to school. So he gets picked on. So what he was trying to use to kind of become invisible achieved the opposite. The second article is about homosexuality. Alex, you included it in your presentation last week. It focuses on Canadian adolescent literature, and the author kind of laments the absence of a strong gay male protagonist, and says that usually they're just secondary characters that present some kind of stress for the hetero main character. And then the third one talks about female masturbation, which fits in perfectly for marginalized sexuality because the author talks about how male masturbation is usually depicted as like a healthy sex drive, where for a female, it kind of invokes stress and sometimes fear. So it's kind of marginalized and almost invisible. And when it is present, it's kind of demonized and disgusting, and the character is pretty much unsalvageable. And so even though this fits in very well with deviant sexuality, I really wanted to include it so that I can make the joke in my introduction of how it lends a hand to the conversation.
Well done.
Thank you. Chapter 2 is about race, so I included your article. You talk about racial marginalization and invisibility as a coping mechanism and as a fourth state of being. And then the other article we also read, she talks about racial marginalization. And remember, she talks about whiteness and pathology, and then the power structures like the family, institution, and the school and the medical system. And then chapter 3 is about disability. So in Meyer's article, the first article, she talks about how in an effort to destabilize normal and humanize those with disabilities, a huge emphasis is put on intelligence, so that actually marginalizes intellectual disability and makes it invisible. And then the second article, she analyzes the representation of disability in YA literature, and she categorizes it into 2 categories. So the first one are normalcy narratives, which are destructive representations of disability. And then the second one are disability counter narratives, which offer resistance to the normalcy narratives. However, I think that's what Meyer was talking about in the first article, that those counter narratives kind of also marginalize at the same time.
Did any of them mention the super crib?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, that's what it, it's the person with a disability who overcomes everything, saves the day. And that's the only way that person's going to be accepted.
Right, but
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
Right, but they always put an emphasis on, but look at how smart they are. So it's like, well, that marginalizes, intellectual disability. And then the last one, on intersectionalities, this article was perfect because it talked about a book called Oreo that features the intersectionality of race, religion, and gender. Specifically a Black Jewish woman. And I think, so this was published in 2019, and I think this is the article that did not mention you, that should have.
Okay.
Because Bromberg references Ralph Ellison.
That's it. That's
yes,
the one.
his Invisible Man.
Did you see where it should have been referenced?
Yes, I did. I did. And I scowled. Right. But he talks about how Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man depicts the invisibility of Black males, while this novel depicts the invisibility of Black females, and more specifically, Jewish Black females. It talks about the pressures of white Jewish racism on Jews of color. So there's all kinds of intersectionalities going on there. And that's my edited collection.
Awesome.
Yay.
Wow, that's good.
Thank you.
Nice variety of articles. Thank you. All right, let's see. Shay, why don't you go ahead and present, or how do you want to do this?
I have a
Do you want me to just put
voiceover.
it up?
Yeah, I sound like quite a goober, but just in case. The presentation for my edited collection, I've decided to do mental illness and its representation in our young adult literature. I happened to notice a trend in some of the novels that we read in class this semester. A lot of them, even if the book wasn't explicitly about mental illness, you could see where mental illness played roles in some of the characters that we came across, just like Junella in Planet of Junior Brown, as well as his music teacher, and just like in what was his face, actually in Fade, where it appeared that schizophrenia had really kind of gotten to him once the Fade took a hold of him. And so that's one of the reasons I've decided to do my edited collection on mental illness and our youth literature. Mental health in today's society is becoming more commonly diagnosed, and it's being discussed much more publicly you'll see it all over social media, Facebook, Instagram, things of that sort. It's individuals and communities are trying to destigmatize the terms mental illness because it is really common it's pretty easy to assume that at least one person you know is dealing with some sort of mental health issue. I personally suffer from depression and anxiety, and I have a son that does as well, in conjunction with his autism. And like I said, it's becoming a much more prevalent thing. These days, 1 in 5 American adults will have some experience with a mental health issue, and and 1 in 25 will deal with a serious mental health issue, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, split personality, things of that sort. But even though it's becoming much more publicly discussed, stigma still remains, and so a lot of people don't talk about it, especially around or with our youth. It's not something that people feel comfortable discussing. As far as our children go, it's very much we need to protect them from such things, or very much and for some adults, it's very much an ignorance is bliss, where they'll bury their head in the sand and just not acknowledge it. But mental illness, mental health concerns are definitely becoming much more prevalent around our children and adolescents, young adults. Like I said, I have a child myself who suffers from depression and anxiety, takes medication, has had therapy. And as it turns out, according to the World Health Organization, approximately 1 in 6 people who are aged 10 to 19 will have some sort of mental illness diagnosis, mental health condition. It's most commonly depression or anxiety among adolescents. And because of this, suicide has actually become the 3rd leading cause of death in our youth aged 15 to 19. All of this can be found on the World Health Organization's website. And so, yes, it's definitely affecting our adolescents and young adults. And seeing it in just the novels that we've read in class made me kind of come to understand that it's mental health awareness and mental illness in these novels is very important. Seeing these issues come up in our novels these days, not just for our young adults, but also for adults. It's commonly called narrative medicine. Rita Sharon has kind of coined the term narrative medicine. It is basically where you bring your narrative abilities to the stories of illness. You combine the clinical knowledge that, say, a physician has with the function of the narrative. Sharon actually defines it as medicine practiced with the narrative competencies to recognize, absorb, interpret, and be moved by the stories of illness. These types of narratives have been around for a while, and they became much more popular around the 80s. But a lot of it has been physical illness. You'll see a lot of narratives that involve cancer, accidents, disabilities, physical disabilities, and things of that sort. It's only within probably the last 10 to 15 years that we've really seen an uptick in what they consider to be sick lit for our youth, and in it dealing with more the mental health crisis, more of the depression and the anxiety, the schizophrenia, the bipolar, and things of that sort. It's become much more popular, I believe, for our youth's novels, because writers are using it as a facilitator to really bring focus to the mental health crisis among not only the youth but our adults. It really kind of brings to focus that this is something that is happening and is common and is being dealt with. It also connects those that are neuronormal to those that are not. I feel like if my neuronormal daughter read a book that focused heavily on depression and anxiety, that she'd be able to understand more and relate more to my son, who does deal with the two conditions. And not only does it make it relatable for those that are neuronormal, but it makes it relatable for those that are not. I feel like my son reading a novel about a health condition that he's dealing with would help him understand more what he's dealing with, and maybe to even give him the ability to talk about it with his peers or me or a doctor, and not allow for the stigma that comes with the diagnosis to really kind of keep him from engaging. And then, and also I feel like these novels have a tendency to give their readers the hope that while there's not typically what they consider a quote-unquote recovery from mental health issues, there are paths to managing and being part of society without, feeling like you can't do things. It really does give the reader hope that they can be a productive member of society, regardless of what their brain may or may not be telling them that they, as far as their depression or anxiety or schizophrenia or any of that sort. So I feel like it's connectable for both sides of the reader. So what I did is I did a quick Google search and typed in popular young adult literature and then, mental illness. And so, of course, popped up the popular 13 Reasons Why. I have not yet read that one. I did purchase it in order to do so. And then several of these other titles that deal with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, loss, and what borderline personality disorder and things of that sort. And there were a lot. This was just a few of the titles that popped up on the multiple lists of books to read as far as mental health goes. And so that's one of the reasons, that's actually why I decided to discuss mental illness in my edited collection, because it is becoming much more prevalent. The scholarship is becoming more prevalent, and it's just something that I feel is very important as far as the ongoing conversation as far as mental illness goes. And so, I mean, basically that's it. That I'm using in my edited collection. I quoted on one of the other slides that I did. So there you go. I hope that helps you guys understand why I chose it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Shay. That was a really good presentation. And I did not know it was called Sicklit. I'm not surprised, because there's, like I said, Criplit or the Super Crit, but it's called Criplit, Chicklit. There's a whole variety of genres that have these different kinds of names now. Jennifer, you want to go?
Yeah, I uploaded it in the discussion board as a link, and then I uploaded a Word document with a link as well in the actual presentation
Okay.
assignment. So it's in a couple places.
Is this right?
To eliminate how identity
Yes, ma'am.
as perceived by others is socially constructed through hierarchical oppression, resulting in the need for resistances such as invisibility. In part 1, identity, a history and analysis of the constructed subjective, meaning how identity is shaped or even forced historically. Though identity has many facets, I focus only on race and gender in this particular presentation and paper. I'll begin by providing historical context for oppressive systems which have shaped or even skewed racial perceptions over time, to include slavery. I draw on Tajania Henderson's article, Property, Penalty, and Racial Profiling, in which Henderson states that, quote, blackness is associated with criminality, which has effectively resulted in racial profiling of people of color, as well as police brutality in some cases. Henderson discusses that there were essentially separate laws that governed slave-wrought plantations in the South in the early 19th century. In other words, the system of governance used to deal with fugitive or rebellious slaves were not the same laws used when managing crimes off of plantations, which opened the door to exploitation and abuse. It can be concluded from Henderson's article that these cases were the first legal reprimands of a racially targeted nature. Because skin color was indicative of slave status, historically, all people of color were susceptible to an undemocratic set of laws and consequences, moving from what was previously a societal hierarchical structure to one of systematic oppression. I then discuss the oppression of females at the same point in history. These systems of differentiation, race and gender, are multidimensional and multigenerational systems which have been fastened as social stigmas and institutions of oppressions for centuries. So because so many people were affected by these unavoidable facets, they've no doubt surfaced in years passing in literature and media. The Color Purple by author and activist Alice Walker sought to expose these trials that women and women of color faced, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and severe lack of basic human rights. Through her character Celie, Walker illuminates the quiet oppression many women and most women of color faced in this time during the early 20th century. Drawing from Twang's article, Don't Tell, Impose Silences in The Color Purple and The Woman Warrior, she describes the many barriers that women, as portrayed in Walker's novel, had to overcome in this time. Walker highlights that Celie was silenced by the men in her life, particularly her stepfather and primary abuser. And later, Celie would end up in an abusive marriage as well, indicating that nearly every male in her life was a form of an oppressor. Celie begins writing to God within the novel because her stepfather explicitly directed her and told her that she could not tell anybody but God about what was going on, or he would kill her mother. Celie learns that through writing she's able to express and even assert herself. And our article, author of the article, Don't Tell, Impose Silences in The Color Purple and The Woman Warrior, acknowledges that even though writing is not the chosen form of articulation within Walker's novel, it is instead a desperate alternative to speech. And this is author Alice Walker. Another example of oppression for women was Deborah Ellis's Parvana's Journey. Notoriously a place which is challenging for women, Parvana's Journey is set in Afghanistan and immediately sets the tone for not only oppression for women, but the dangers as well. Ellis explicitly writes on page 13 of the novel that the Taliban hated women. In the opening pages of her novel, the reader learns that it's unacceptable for women to be out of the house without being accompanied by a male and without wearing a burqa, both of which Parvana is immediately guilty of at the novel's start. Women were denied access to education, which explains why Parvana clutched so tightly to her father's books, which he received illegally while being educated in England. And like Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, Parvana also finds her voice through writing, where she begins writing her friend Shazia, and realizes that she's able to articulate herself and be honest. So author of The Production and Use of Globalized Child, Margaret Steffler, challenges the notion of advocacy through literature and states that if not careful, these novels could exploit these matters and remove the unique characteristics of each situation, while authors are benefiting from this. In other words, companies and authors, if not careful, risk promoting themselves in a capital nature by advocating for children who suffer in these ways. Steffler is quoted as saying the following about Deborah Ellis. She generally donates royalties to various organizations, including Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan. Ellis is successfully and publicly grounding the words and sentences of humanism in the practical realm of humanitarianism, thus making a powerful connection between the word and the world. But these good intentions also raise uneasiness. The practice of fictionalizing and telling stories of children in desperate situations, such as in Afghanistan and Bolivia, instigates uncomfortable feelings about the potential exploitation of the child's situation and voice. This then begs the question of whether it is possible to be an advocate and mouthpiece for the invisible or oppressed without gaining from the situation monetarily, or of greater concern, telling these stories accurately without experiencing that trauma and oppression firsthand. So essentially, there have been many forms of oppression and systems of oppression, specifically toward women and people of color, historically. And because of that kind of pressure and oppression, whether fictional or real, it begs the question of what happens when individuals reject the social interpretations or stigmas and tire of such perpetual subjectivity. Part 2, resistance. Invisibility. Is it a curse to not be seen or a superpower? Invisibility appears in young adult novels as something that one has to contend with, but also as a device employed intentionally. In the real world, there have been civil responses to oppression, such as the marches on Washington in the 60s, or violent protests and aggressive riots, but a particular mode of resistance has remained visible in society and fiction, and that is invisibility. First mentioned implicitly as a mode of resistance by author Ralph Ellison in his powerful novel Invisible Man, Ellison's theory of invisibility has resurfaced in literature many times and in a lot of different creative forms. Ellison used the traditional binary of visible and invisible to generate his theory, which portrays African Americans' experience of oppression, isolation, and lack of educational or employment opportunities as a result of whites' refusal to acknowledge African Americans, as evidenced in his prologue. Since the 52 publication of Invisible Man, the theory has newly been applied to more than just the African American population, but other minority populations who have experienced similar mistreatment and abuse, including women. In an article written by Tom Lieber, quote, Ralph Ellison and the Metaphor of Invisibility explains that there are actually two distinct forms of invisibility which appear in literature, and that Ellison employs the first, which he refers to as inherent invisibility, which is when one's imperceptibility is not a choice, but exists due to others' unwillingness and refusal to recognize or acknowledge them. The second, he writes, is, quote, a manifest in the metaphor of mask wearing, and deals with the invisibility that is not necessarily inherent in one's relationship to society, but rather produced by the conscious adoption of a false identity, which hides and may eventually usurp the true identity beneath. In other words, people must create a facade or behave in ways that potentially betray their true selves in order to coexist in mainstream society. In her article, The Ellison Tradition, Invisible Bodies of Adolescent and YA Fiction, author Susan Stewart explains the literary impact of Ellison's theory and argues that the theory of invisibility survives today because the same issues which inspired Ellison's original theory have likewise survived. Stewart states that invisibility as a mode of resistance is employed intentionally by fictional characters when faced with situations of intense anxiety, pressure, and discomfort. As Stewart illustrates in her article, these many different facets of invisibility are evident in a plethora of young adult novels, including Robert Cormier's Fade. In a creative twist on Ellison's theory, Cormier's protagonist, 13-year-old Paul Moreau, has the unnatural ability to fade, meaning literally disappear and become physically invisible from the view of others. Though both Invisible Man and Fade deal primarily with men of color, Ellison's theory has been applied to other people groups who face similar mistreatments. In her article, The Relationship Between the Invisibility of African American Women and the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s and Their Portrayals in Modern Film, author Martha Lott explores how women have been stuck in a cycle of invisibility for decades. Having been largely unrecorded and unrecognized in the past, has perpetuated women's lack of recognition and media presence today. Lott specifically discusses African American women in the time of the Civil Rights Movement and draws on reporters and historians to establish that despite the fact that women worked tirelessly in that time period to organize protests and movements, they received no acknowledgement whatsoever by the dominant males involved in the same movements. Because of this, they remain perpetually invisible. Moving to a contemporary setting, authors Priya Balakrishnan and Devin Magliozzi found that invisibility is still being used by women in the contemporary setting intentionally to increase their likelihood of success in the workplace. They conducted a modern study at a large nonprofit organization and chronicled their findings in their article called Intentional Invisibility, Professional Women and the Navigation of Workplace Constraints. They concluded from this study that there is a recursive relationship between structure and socialization. In other words, the hierarchy in the workplace affects how people within the workplace act. When examining women and conducting interviews, it was determined by both that, quote, we find that women facing structural constraints such as unequally distributed household responsibilities and gender-biased organizational policies adopt a low-risk strategy of conflict avoidance that we call intentional invisibility. It's argued by Balakrishan and Magliozzi that these behaviors and responses to biased professional hierarchies will be detrimental to their professional growth, as career advancement often requires a presence and display of hard work that cannot be achieved when one is, quote, intentionally invisible. Due to these socially constructed confines, it's natural to see responses and resistance to these confines in the form of protests, riots, or invisibility, the latter of which has resurfaced and surfaced repeatedly in young adult novels over the years. The question remains whether invisibility is a viable response, and if not, what will happen next in order to promote a necessary change for what has been a comprehensive period of turmoil for so many marginalized individuals.
Jennifer, what program did you use to create that?
I was wondering that too.
So I made a Sway. It's like an office program. That I used it now instead of PowerPoint. And then through Quick Player, is that what it's called? QuickTime, sorry. Through QuickTime, you can do screen recording, so it just records whatever you're looking at on the screen. So I actually did a split screen, kind of like a screenshot, but it records the whole time. And so I did a split screen, so what I was reading was on the right that you guys couldn't see. And then what you guys could see obviously was being recorded on the left. And so you just talk over it. So I use it for like videos and for my students and stuff all the time. But it'll record whatever.
It's really good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah,
It was really
PowerPoint, because you can do so much with Sway. It's amazing. And all the photos and everything are generated right through Sway. And it's creepy, but it picks up on what you're talking about. And it actually adjusts the color and the setting and the fonts and all that based on that. So when I do historical stuff, it makes it the old script fonts and old paper. And this I was doing invisibility or whatever, and it kind of changed it to that black and white. And it's kind of neat. I mean, it's weird that it prompts that, but yeah, it's Sway, and it's right there available. My district uses Office, Microsoft, so all of that's provided through the district. So I have my kids use Sway. But yeah, the voiceover thing is really cool for instruction. So it'll record whatever, and then you see the screenshot that you're taking, and then you stop it whenever you're done.
How cool, thanks.
Yeah, that's very cool. So you go to sway.office.com and it'll give you information on that.
They just auto-save, and they're all there, so every Sway I've made is just there. Yeah. But it's really neat, and you can do it I did mine vertical, right? So I was scrolling up and down. But they have ones that are horizontal, and it's basically a lot like making a website, kind of, really. But the stack thing is one of my favorite things, which is when I forgot to do it for Ellis's photo, but you can create as many photos as you want in a stack, you're flipping through photos. So when I showed you guys Alice Walker's photo, you just click on it, and it's almost like you're looking through photos. But really, a lot of really cool features on there on Sway.
It's cool. Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Now I have another thing to look at to consume my time, to be drawn into a black hole.
Really neat program. It's really cool.
Hi, Daisy.
Hi.
So how do you want us to do? How are we doing yours?
So I recorded an awful voiceover.
Okay.
So I think I submitted an updated version underneath the assignment for the presentation. And I get to follow Jennifer's amazing one, so that's wonderful.
Thanks again, Jennifer.
Thanks again, Jennifer.
That was visually just really, I can't wait.
Oh, thank you.
So that means I'm not going to do any grading.
Yeah, it was really great, Jennifer.
Hello everyone, this is Daisy Carmona, and this is my presentation for my edited collection over the role of Latinx young adult literature in transforming American canon.
Specifically, my collection looks at the scholarship available surrounding the representation of Latinx authors and protagonists, and also brings into conversation how the current literature emulates various forms of resistance against traditional dominant voices. The scholarship I aggregated primarily utilized the framework of critical race theory to evaluate representation and resistance in children's and YA literature. And I really wanted to focus on finding scholarship that talks about CRT because in the beginning of this course, we started with critical race theory. And I kept that in the back of my mind as we were reading our novels throughout the sequence of the course, and found that just really useful when evaluating the different characters and resistance and visibility that we talked about and learned about each week. So a lot of the scholarship that I tried to aggregate in my collection either utilizes CRT, or I thought that the framework was similar in some way to CRT. Okay, so young adult literature as a window and mirror. I call this slide my Snoopy slide, but let me talk a little bit about why Snoopy is relevant to my collection. So the scholarship surrounding representation in my collection emphasizes the importance for young adults of all populations to have the ability to read literature and see themselves in the characters. When we consider how literature functions, especially YA literature, Rudine Sims Bishop's concept of windows and mirrors is metaphorical for how young adults engage with the stories and characters found within the books that they read. Latinx young adults do not always perceive the world in the same way that is depicted in traditional American canon, especially Anglo canon. Therefore, the emergence of new Latinx YA literature is so important. This emerging literature serves as a window in which young adults from all cultural backgrounds, all populations can view and understand the Latinx culture. And it also serves as a mirror for Latinx young adults as it provides literature that mirrors back to them their own lives and experiences. So what Bishop is saying is that Latinx young adult literature, or any type of literature that's specific to a population, especially a marginalized population, it provides a window for young adults of all cultures and backgrounds to see and understand the culture that's depicted in that book. And it serves as a mirror for the young readers where they can see characters and narratives that look like them, that reflect them, and that provides that mirror back to them when they read that literature. Okay, so now looking at Schultz's Snoopy comic, this really depicts that idea of the differences in what we see in the mirror and how that was reflected in what we read. So we start, if we look at the comic here, in the very beginning, we see Snoopy typing beauty tips with the phrase, "Always remember that beauty is only skin deep." However, when Snoopy looks in the mirror, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to him that beauty is skin deep. It would make a lot more sense to him that beauty is only fur deep. Yet, when Woodstock sees this, he protests the idea that beauty is fur deep, because for Woodstock, beauty would instead be feather deep. Woodstock also saw a different image in the mirror, just like Snoopy originally saw that different image in the mirror. So therefore, as Bishop emphasizes, the only truth we're really left with is that beauty is. Literature is interpreted by youth in such a personal manner. It's usually contextual, and it's based upon our individual perceptions or their individual perceptions of the world.
When children and young adults cannot find themselves in the books that they read, or when the books they see are distorted, negative, unfamiliar, or if they're looking for feathers and they see fur, then this really sends a powerful message about how they are devalued in the society of which they are part, in the society that they live and grow up in. Okay, so I did want to just quickly share this quote by Sim Bishop it's from her work with Windows and Mirrors, and she says, "Books are sometimes windows offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading, then, becomes a means of self-affirmation, and readers often seek their mirrors in books. If young adults do not see mirrors in the books they read, as I said, this really sends that powerful message that they are not valued in society. And it also creates dominant epistemologies for young readers that may not reflect their lives or their cultures or their experiences or backgrounds. Historically, non-white readers have found the search for characters that look like themselves in some ways pretty challenging. But that is starting to change, so that's good. Okay, so why is this edited collection important? It is important because, for the most part, Latinx YA literature has been largely unexplored in Latinx studies, and especially outside of Latinx studies, particularly in the humanities. Authorship and representation of Latinx protagonists is beginning to increase, but there's still a need for more representation of the cultural, social, and gender identities that can only be portrayed by Latinx protagonists. And just briefly, one of the articles that I found, and I think it was by Rodriguez, she studied Newbery book winners and found that historically, the minimal representation that was present of Latinx characters weren't even written by Latinx authors. Some of them were, but a large part of them were written by white authors. So there's a need for Latinx authors to write literature that depicts those cultural, social, and other complex issues that can only be portrayed by Latinx protagonists. There's also an absence in scholarship by Latinx authors analyzing the fact that there's an absence in scholarship. And so as the representation of Latinx YA literature grows, so should the scholarship that evaluates how emerging authors can ensure that future representations empower and promote Latinx young adults in identifying themselves in the available literature. Okay, so how does my collection function? As I mentioned earlier, a lens of critical race theory, also of Latino critical race theory, so LatCrit. Part 1 looks at Latinx representation, both historical and present. A lot of the scholarship in this part of the collection talks about how important it is for young adults to see themselves in the books they read, so Bishop's idea of windows and mirrors. Part 2, I look at resistance and counter-narratives. Moving on from representation, Part 2 aggregates scholarship that utilizes critical race theory, specifically the idea of counter-storytelling or counter-narratives, to bring into conversation how Latinx YA literature is a form of resistance. I also look at how through conocimiento narratives, or different ways of knowing, that adolescents find a way to form alternative epistemologies and a path to healing.
So clonosemiontol narratives, they challenge violence, they challenge oppression, and some of the scholarship in this area also looks at trauma and oppression. Okay, so part one, just a quick look at some of the articles. Acevedo looks at what it means to be Puerto Rican in children's literature, or Latinx Puerto Rican. Barry's article is the article that talks about the Newbery book. She does a deep dive into Hispanic representation. Garcia looks at intersections of Latinx studies in Chicano young adult literature. Haas looks at diversity and Latinx representation in Caldecott winners. And then Rodriguez looks at immigration, specifically looking at the historical ways that resistance are depicted in YA literature. Mostly historical talks about assimilation. And then also this part one, like I've already said, a lot of the scholarship brings in or connects Bishop's idea of mirrors and windows, and really how it provides a window for privileged populations and a mirror for marginalized populations. Okay, real quick, part two, resistance and alternative epistemologies. So some of the articles are Garcia's Encountering YA, the really great article that talks about the Young Lords, the novel Shadow Shapers. Rodriguez, her article, Conocimiento Narratives. This one talks about creative acts and how knowing, the act of knowing, can allow young readers to create alternative epistemologies and challenge the dominant ones that are primarily seen in traditional canon. And then also, lastly, Rodriguez also looks at school fights, so resisting oppression in the classroom, and the novel Juanita Fights the School Board. But more than one of the articles references some of the novels that we talked about in class. So Esperanza Rising, The Revolution of Evelyn Serrano, all of those are also looked at under the lens of CRT as counter narratives or counter stories to those dominant voices. Okay, and I guess last, just in conclusion, the future. This edited collection, I think, or hopefully enforces that the new generation of Latinx literature is really beginning to create a space for everyone. Young Latinx authors are creating multidimensional characters and numbers that, until recently, maybe felt impossible. And the representation in literature has really begun to increase, but I think it's time now to ask for more than just representation. It's not enough that Latinx characters are beginning to exist instead of not existing. It's really time to see just a wide range of characters that rival, the varied white characters that we have been reading about for so long. Okay, I believe that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Daisy. I think I want to read your edited collection.
I don't know why there was such a delay. I checked it. It's like, yeah, it was like the delayed. I'm sorry, guys.
Oh, that's all right. We don't care, do we?
We got to see it all, so we're good.
Yeah, that all works. Okay, Jill, how should we do yours? It's a voiceover, right?
No, I didn't. I knew I was going to. If you can just click through the PowerPoint for me.
Okay, will do.
I chose from my top, well, I actually changed it at the last minute, or I altered it at the last minute because I couldn't find satisfactory articles, and it just wasn't coming together. Initially, what I wanted to do was consumerism in dystopian novels, but I just couldn't find enough, so I kind of had to branch out a little bit. So that's why.
So that means that That means you need to write that article.
Yes, I think so. I'm very passionate about all this now, so that may be what I do next semester. I don't know. But so Feed was my inspiration for the collection. I've been basically obsessed with this book ever since we read it. It's just really hit home with me for some reason. So I didn't focus on Feed, of course, for the collection, but I did use it kind of as a commonality throughout. And it was mentioned in a good portion of all the articles I chose, because if you search for consumerism in young adult literature, or consumerism in dystopian, or consumerism in anything that has to do with literature, Feed comes up for a good reason. I also chose it because I think it's really relevant. Consumerism, capitalism, targeted marketing, all that is really relevant in our world today, more so than what I think we want to admit. And I said in my paper that, Feed seems outlandish, but it's really not that far a leap from where we are right now. Especially probably I can mention to y'all that I'm hungry for tacos right now, and I'll get on Facebook and I'll have ads, for tacos.
Taco Bell,
So,
here we come.
and it's true. So, it's really not that far off. And then, of course, how does literature or young adult literature play a part in the consumerism and the commodification, really, of our youth? So the articles that I chose kind of create an arc from early consumerism, like post-World War II era, to the result of what is now climate fiction, that's really bringing a focus on climate change and climate catastrophe. And so my collection kind of just does an arc from there. There was a lot of common threads through each category. Identity, of course, was big in everything. How the person or the characters or even the reader identified as an individual or part of a group. Were they part of the masses that just are led blindly? Or are they part of the collective that are multiple groups that work as one? Were they being a consumer by their own choice, or are they being led by the nose by corporations? So there was a lot of duality there. Targeted marketing and reader positioning were big, and I'll get into all these in a little bit. And pretty much the theme all the way across was capitalism is evil. So, of course, obviously capitalism in itself isn't evil, but there are some really controversial aspects of it, and that's relevant for today right now too. And risk society and risk theory, Beck's risk theory was mentioned quite a bit, and that's something that I could just do a whole other collection on. And I don't really understand it completely, but it's basically that we live in a time now that is technologically different from any time there's ever been, and we've got risks are out there that we've never had to deal with before, from technology, from all kinds of advancements, and it's up to society to determine when that risk is appropriate and when it's too much. And part of the problem seems to be, especially when you get to a world like Feed, was the society had become so consumerized that they weren't willing to look beyond their immediate gratification to see the damage that was being done to the rest of the world. They sit there and their skin's sloughing off, basically, but they can order, those blue jeans. And so that's kind of what risk society leads to there. I guess you can go to the next. These are most of the books that were mentioned in the article. In the articles, of course, Feed was in a lot of them. As far as dystopian literature, Mortal Engines was another really popular one. That one's basically a post-nuclear world where giant cities, and particularly London was one of them, are on these big tracks, and they just roll across the landscape and gobble up what they call static towns. And it's supposed to be kind of a metaphor of capitalism, global capitalism eating up third world countries and such. Rash was also, those top three, Feed, Mortal Engines, and Rash, were pretty popular as in all the articles. Rash was about a time in the future when corporations had taken over, merged and taken over, and basically operated off of prisoner labor. And the main character in this one in particularly was a boy that was in prison for a year for throwing an apricot on the ground, because that just everything was a crime, because they, everybody needed to be a prisoner so they'd have enough labor. And his year of prison was sold to the Coca-Cola Corporation, and he worked for them for that year. And so anyway, there's quite a few to get into the, barcoding skin and genetics and all kinds of different things that corporations did to manipulate the population or their consumers. And then on the other side of it were these more contemporary literature books. Flush was kind of about pollution. Speak. Well, I'll talk about that. I'll talk about those later. The Gossip Girl series was, of course, also is very important as far as consumerism and product placement goes, as were the Insiders. Going on 16 and Rosemary were older ones. Those were written in the 40s, and those were the ones I'll start with as far as planting the seeds of.
Trademark.
Yeah, I wanted to throw this in because this information kept coming up, and we're talking about why this is relevant and why this is important to research and do some exploration on the commodification of our youth. And this, these stats are just kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. That our kids on average are exposed to 40,000 commercials a year, over 100 a day. And that's not just, I don't think, on television, but just in general. And that how schools, and that's the school TM, schools are starting to, not just starting to, but for a while, they have sponsored programs like videos and training things directly from corporations. They get sponsored materials, like how many chocolate chips are in a Chips Ahoy cookie and such like that, and even contracts with soda and snack, vendors and such. And and I saw something on Facebook not too long ago about a teacher having Target sponsor her classroom. So that's where the trademark school, like in Feed, eventually comes from. It's not too far of a leap from where we're at. And then when you get into higher ed, there was just a couple of examples that $500 million contract with Caltech for biotech research, but it's from British Petroleum is who is the contracts with. And, global warming research at Stanford that's sponsored by ExxonMobil. So, you got to, you got to kind of question where that is leading. So anyway, that's
it's like they're purchasing.
Yeah, exactly.
Academia.
And you wonder why people question, science now. And So, it's just scary that the corporate environment is infiltrating, basically everything. But our schools in particular, of course, I was relating that to the feed, and their school system. But so that's why this is important, that we need to understand how, our children are being affected by our consumer society right now. And these are the same kids that are going to have to deal with the climate change and everything else that comes from, what's going on. All right, so you can go to the next one. So I divided mine into 4 sections. And the first section is just called Planting the Seeds. And this is where Rosemary, Going on 16, Gossip Girls, and the Insiders came in. And one of the topics that kind of ranged in here were identity, product placement, early consumerism, targeted marketing, and literature selling out. And I'll get to that in just a second. It has to do with that Kathy's book. But Rosemary and Going on 16 were featured in Alan's article, The Cinderella Makers, and she discussed basically how folk tales reflected more of a feudal system, economic system, and then we went to fairy tales that reflected more of a advanced Victorian era, early capitalist thing. And then I think my granddaughter's about to come in, so if I get interrupted. And then she went to what she calls commodity tales. And that was kind of this genre of young adult literature that was put out in the early, just post-World War II. And it was targeted specifically to white female teenagers of the time. And it was basically Cinderella-esque stories about finding the right dress, and being accepted into the right social circles and determining their identity as a consumer. But in all these stories, they got the new dress, but one picked one that was made of nylon and not silk, so she was not accepted. And one was gingham when it should have been a plain color, so they're kind of failed Cinderella stories. But what it was early consumerism being taught to these young women, because eventually they were going to be the housewives who were going to be the consumer. And it was just some early indoctrination there. And it's also about this time she talks about Disney was one of the first ones to do cross advertising or cross marketing. They had their films, they also had the products. And this was one of the first times that children were exposed to media and product sales at the same time. One advertised the other. And it seemed to be that was kind of where the idea took off, where, capitalism on paper works well because the consumer drives the market. The corporations have to put out the product that the consumer wants. But what has happened now and what began to happen here was it switched. Corporations now tell us
What y'all got going on over here?
And that's kind of where things have gone awry. And so then I leaped a little bit forward to like Gossip Girls and Insiders, where these are more contemporary books for young adults that have a lot of brand placement and a lot of identity formed around what brand shoe or clothing and drink, and there's some really hard consumerism that goes on there. And this Kathy's book was mentioned in particular, I think it was in 2006. It said this was the first time that a major corporation, and it was Procter & Gamble, made a contract with the publishing house to have their products specifically put into this line of books. And the author got a lot of backlash from it, evidently, and she said in this article that she quoted her, she basically said that she was told she would either put it in there or it wouldn't get published. So, you know.
I know what I'd do.
Yeah, well, I know. It's, you got to wonder. Very interesting. So CoverGirl products, very specifically, are throughout this book, and I think it's a series now. So it said that was kind of a watershed moment in literature, because up until this time, literature was supposed to have been considered above this. You know, you have TV shows and films, and of course social media now, but not then, where there's always been, you know, product placement. You know, you see them drinking a Coke or whatever. But literature kind of held themselves above that standard as a whole until this moment. And this was kind of the breaking of the dam there, where corporations are now, you know, your kids can't read a book without being safe from targeted marketing. So that's where the literature sells out part comes from. So what this also did, it talked about the Insiders. The Insiders is a book about some elite New York socialite teen boys, and it's lots of product placement. You know, they drink Bacardi and they wear, I can't even remember all the brands because I can't afford them, so I don't know what they are, but it's all the really high dollar stuff. And what she talks about is what's become the norm a little bit with young people now is it doesn't have anything to do with if they can afford to buy the product. Their social status comes from the ability to know and to get that product is stylish. So they can still be in those circles even without owning the product. It comes from understanding what is accepted as cool and what isn't. And
hey, Jill,
mm-hmm.
I know you have a few more slides, so, but we kind of need to speed it up a little bit.
Okay, go to the next one. This one's I'll go kind of quick. The term commodity fetishism came up, and I thought that was a really interesting word. And it's basically just, you know, being attracted to certain products and certain goods. But what this is, the good, the bad, and capitalism, the article, The Coming of Age in Suburbia, she makes the point that in the characters in these books and some teens, they can use consumerism as a structure to hold themselves up while they're recovering from some sort of a trauma, or, you know, an accident, sexual assault, or that kind of thing. They can create an identity based on, you know, the products they buy and still fit in the social circles while they're healing inside. So that's kind of an interesting aspect to identity there. The bad is the other article talks about book Rash, where it's the prisoner farms and where the corporations have gone from there. And she also talks a lot about biotech and such. So that was a lot about identity. And then we can go on to the next one. This is an area that talked mostly about the dystopian novels, and they talk a lot about positioning the reader in a way like Feed, for instance, or Mortal Engines. You can relate to them, but they're a little far enough out that you have some perspective, and that it's important to create this critical position to be able to see outside of your own ideology or your own culture, your own, you know, economic system or whatever, and recognize the problems. You know, and it kind of leads to a little more. And they also talk about a lot of the difference between the masses and the multitudes, and that goes into a lot of theories that I didn't have time to get into here. And this is also where we talked a lot about risk theory and risk society, which I've already talked about. And this is basically where we get into the cli-fi, climate fiction, climate crisis, catastrophes era. And this is the other end of consumerism and capitalism. And this is where we're at in Feed at the end, you know, basically. And again, they talk about identity, the characters that are bystanders, and the characters that are the rebels, you know, and how this can create empathy and activism in young readers by seeing the catastrophe at the end and being able to relate that to what's going on now. And I think that's it. The last page is just kind of going back over everything I've said.
Okay, there's some, I'm glad you provided those lists for us, because there's some there that I want to look at. I just brought up Rash by Peter Hoffman, and I've read books by him before. And by the way, did you know that there is a series, a British series called Feed? No, The Feed. Has anybody seen it yet?
Oh, on Prime right now?
I think it's Netflix. It's either Netflix.
Yeah, I saw a preview.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It is not, it is an adaptation of a different novel called The Feed. But you can see the commonalities, and it's pretty darn good and scary. Mm-hmm. Power gone amok. So thank you. Well, Greg said you were partying.
My name's Kirsty, and the title of my edited collection is Racial Trauma. They live it, they read it, so what?
Good title.
I used 3 primary texts in my introduction to my edited collection, including Dear Martin, which we're all familiar with from this semester, written by Nick Stone, Monster by Walter Dean Myers, and Angie Thomas's novel, The Hate You Give. Now, only one of my articles mentions one of these novels, and the rest of them I will connect to other novels mentioned in the articles. Part 1 of my edited collection is titled Trauma and Racial Violence. The first article is called The Trauma Lens of Police Violence Against Racial and Ethnic Minorities. This article not only defines police brutality, but explains some of the reasons as to why most incidents of police brutality, especially against minorities, are left unreported or unconvicted. More importantly, the authors discuss psychological interpersonal trauma and discuss how disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder can result from one's experience or constant exposure to racial violence, including police brutality. The consequences of racist incident-based traumas include anxiety, depression, aggression, mistrust, and psychosocial difficulties. When these authors conducted their own search through databases such as PsycInfo regarding psychological literature, they determined that using keywords like race and trauma yielded minimal results, commenting on the lack of study of racist incidents, such as police brutality. They also mentioned intergenerational trauma, which served as a launching point for their research, investigating a better framework for analyzing the consequences of police brutality. They also look at intergenerational trauma in more of a historical context, as trauma is passed down from generation to generation. Chapter 2 of my edited collection uses the introduction of J. Roger Kurtz's text, Trauma and Literature. The introduction starts by describing how society has changed traumatic events to range from casual events to very catastrophic events, and mentioning that trauma and literature both require interpretation. He continues on by breaking up the introduction into 3 different sections. The origin section gives us a background of trauma theory and the scholars that helped develop it. The development section intersects trauma and literature and discusses how those relate to one another. The section I found most useful for my edited collection was the application section. which discuss the effects of trauma in literature and in the real world. My next article is entitled Monstrous Acts Problematizing Violence in Young Adult Literature. The beginning of the article mentions the normalization of violence in our society as a whole. And while the authors acknowledge that scholars have begun to talk about how violence is presented through media, they argue that there's a lack of discussion about violence as presented in young adult literature. They do agree that more realistic representations are being added to young adult literature and that that needs to continue to happen. They go on to define violence in many different forms, such as individual, institutional, and structural cultural violence, each causing conditions of oppression and aggression. They go on to analyze 8 different novels of contemporary, realistic young adult fiction, including Monster. So this article actually does mention one of my primary texts, but not very much. They do say that Monster has examples of individual and institutional violence because the protagonist is in prison throughout the novel and is actually writing a screenplay of what he's going through. In the conclusion of the article, the scholars suggest discussing racial profiling, justice, and institutional violence. The next article I found was really interesting. It was called Skin Tone Trauma, Historical and Contemporary Influences on Health and Interpersonal Outcomes of African Americans. They introduced the article by discussing the film Nina, where a light-skinned African American actress was cast to play the role of Nina Simone, who was a Grammy Award-winning dark-skinned African American female. They commented that the role required extra makeup and prosthetics to resemble a more realistic representation of the artist, and critiques of the movie claimed that the opportunity was taken away from darker-skinned African American auditioners, and they lead into defining what colorism is, which is basically the unequal treatment and discrimination of individuals on the basis of the lightness or darkness of their skin tone. They also talk about racial trauma and those who experience racism or colorism are affected by traumatic experiences or traumatic effects of that. And they call to action saying that we need to unmask skin tone wounds and stop sweeping colorism under the rug in order to heal traumatic stress within those experiences. Part 2 of my edited collection is titled Young Adult Text Studies of Trauma and Race. So these articles do specifically mention novels, just not the novels I am going to talk about. However, I do connect these novels to the primary novels at the beginning of my presentation. So the first article was Power in Our Words, Finding Community and Mitigating Trauma in James Dashner's The Maze Runner. So the author begins this article by discussing the rarity of dystopian trauma. Trauma is not often found in dystopian novels, but the author argues that The Maze Runner is not about trauma, however, it performs trauma. So the setting and the plot of the novel help create the trauma theory throughout the novel. The author also discusses the traumatic memory, the fragmentization of that through the flashbacks that the main character has throughout his experience in the maze. They go on to argue that fragmentized traumatic memory replicates the way that trauma is dealt with in the real world. Basically, the premise of the article, using the Maze Runner as an example, allows Eliot to showcase how dystopian young adult novels can be read as trauma literature, even though it's not the popular type of, the popular genre for trauma literature. One of my favorite articles I use is called Keeping It Real, Walter Dean Myers and the Promise of African American Children's Literature. Now, one of my texts, primary texts at the beginning of my presentation, is written by Walter Dean Myers. This article celebrates Walter Dean Myers for providing readers with those realistic representations of African Americans and their experiences, even if they don't always end with a happy ending. They do use Somewhere in the Darkness as an example. At the beginning of the article, they discuss how it's great that literature has become more multicultural, but we kind of need to follow African American literature needs to follow Myers' example to become more reflective of young Black leadership. This is the article that I used in one of our past assignments that talks about the two stereotypical African American men, one being a money-hungry or money-driven millionaire, and the other being a thug. And so this really brings together all of the different aspects of African American literature while providing Walter Dean Myers as a great example for other authors to follow. This next article is a little bit different from my other ones. It's called Trauma and Young Adult Literature, Representing Adolescence and Knowledge in David Small Stitches, a Memoir. This is a little bit different, not only because it's a memoir, but because the placement of this specific memoir is argued, because normally David Small is a children's author and illustrator, and because of the trauma shown in this memoir, they decided to place this in the young adult category, while some critics argue that it should have been placed in the adult nonfiction category. They do a comparison of this memoir to The Glass Castle, especially emphasizing the fact that in Stitches, the beginning of the text starts with him as a child, and in The Glass Castle, Walls is an adult at the beginning, and she is looking back on her life. They argue that the lack of moral uplift or principle makes Small's novel inadequate and rendering it controversial in the young adult genre category. And my last article is titled Race Trauma at the End of the Millennium, Narrative Passing in Philip Roth's The Human Stain. This article was so interesting because it discussed passing in literature. She not only discusses passing, but talks about the traumatic effects of doing so. So she defines passing as crossing the color line or a racial in-betweenness. The author discusses the consequences of impartial racial identity by passing, and I relate this to Justice in Dear Martin. Although Justice doesn't try to pass off as a white man, he finds himself caught in that racial binary because he is not in those two stereotypical African American categories that R.D. Lane talked about in the Keeping It Real article. So that's my presentation. I've gone on a little over time, so I'm sorry. But I hope you guys enjoy everything and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsty. I thought Jamisa was going to be here, in fact, this evening. Did anybody hear from her? No. Okay. I'm not sure what to do with it. I guess. I don't know. I'll figure it out.
Whatever decision you make will be the right decision.
Explored the portrayal of sexual assault in young adult fiction, and I focused on the survivor, the person who survived the sexual assault, and their invisibility. And taking kind of a different approach to invisibility, I wanted to look at the different ways that these survivors became invisible, so kind of the cause of their invisibility, For some, it's a mental form of invisibility. They are either excommunicating themselves, others based on bullying.
I'm sorry?
And
I'm sorry, Allie Schmaltz.
Or not believing them have mentally excommunicated these survivors. And then also, interestingly, there's a spatial excommunication in a lot of these young adult novels. And sometimes that mental and that spatial excommunication happen concurrently. And so that kind of causes both a literal and a mental figurative invisibility in the survivors. And then also because of that invisibility, so looking at the beginning and then the end, an effect of that invisibility is that they lose their credibility. So we often know a lot of times with survivors of sexual assault, they are not given credibility over their own stories and over their own lives. And so I want to look at how that is represented in these novels. And then also they are given a lack of agency. So because they are made invisible, either partly by the mental trauma that they are experiencing or usually accompanied by the people that they are around, they no longer have an ability to have agency over their lives, over their actions, over what happens to them. And in a couple of these novels they do, but there's a twist in kind of how they have that agency. Okay, so the articles I want to add to this in my edited collection, but the 3 that I have right now are as follows. So I want to talk, the first one I would like to talk about is Karzowski's article, The Postmortal Rape Survivor and the Paradox of Female Agency Across Different Media. And so she specifically looks at Alice Sebold's The Lovely Bones, and she looks at the difference between the film adaptation and then the novel. And what I looked at with this one was the agency in the survivors and the difference in the agency. And for Susie, the protagonist of the novel, she is given agency, but only after she dies. So if you have ever read The Lovely Bones, the protagonist is actually dead, and she is given agency to tell her story and given credibility only after she has been murdered. And this is also true for Hannah in 13 Reasons Why. After committing suicide, she releases the tapes and is given some sort of like pseudo agency over what happens. Obviously her life has ended, but there are some things that go on with her death. So I want to look at, or I did look at the agency of those two kind of post mortem. Okay, the second one I wanted to look at was Mason's article. And Mason's article is the psychological consequences of sexual assault. I think this is incredibly important to outline before we can understand how sexual assault is represented. So it's more factual in nature. It outlines myths and stereotypes and pre and post rape reactions, which is incredibly important when looking at invisibility, and obviously looking at the psychological reactions as well. So in order for us to understand the portrayal of sexual assault trauma in young adult literature, it's absolutely imperative for us as readers to understand that, a couple of facts, right? So for instance, the majority of rapes are committed by a person known to the survivor, thus the psychological reactions that follow will drive the survivor away from the perpetrator. And thus, right, if they're being driven away from the perpetrator, they're going to be driven away from the community. And if a perpetrator is someone known to them, whether it's like Hannah at school or like the Lovely Bones kind of a neighbor, or the most recent fiction piece in young adult literature where it is a incestuous rape, the community, the perpetrator, is their home, it's their safe place, and so they actually have to leave that safe space in order to get any sort of solace, which is kind of obviously counterintuitive. And then the last one is Amber Moore's article, The Traumatic Geographies, Mapping the Violent Landscapes Driving YA Rape Survivors Indoors. And so she actually outlines like the literal locations of rapes in various novels, and where the trauma has originated for each character, and then she analyzes its implications. So a lot of rapes in the novels that she looked at, and in a lot of rapes in young adult literature, they happen outside. I could think of 3 of my novels at least that is true. And so there is like a literal outside that happens, right? Like being outdoors. And then in everyone else, there's the outside of the domestic home of the survivor. And so part of the psychological reaction with this post-rape involves the survivor excommunicating herself from the outside and closing herself indoors, and sort of like as a spatial precaution. So those are kind of my sexual assault scholarship pieces I want to look at. So the primary texts, I have 4 right now. I have Speak by Laurie Anderson, 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher, The Lovely Bones by Alice Bold, and My Absolute Darling by Gabrielle Talent. And just kind of like I was talking about earlier, 13 Reasons Why and The Lovely Bones, Susie and The Lovely Bones, they both are given agency only after their death, where the protagonist in both My Absolute Darling and Speak are robbed of their agency because they are robbed of their credibility. They are excommunicated and not believed. And yes, that is true also for Hannah in 13 Reasons Why, but like I said, post death and post rape, she is given some sort of pseudo agency. So kind of the relevancy, I know I'm kind of going over time here, but I wanted to talk about the relevancy as a high school teacher. I deal with a lot of students, unfortunately, that have experienced some form of sexual assault, and I also deal with the constant battle of what is okay to read and what is not okay to read. And, the relevancy of how sexual assault trauma is portrayed in young adult literature is basically because of these three things right here: visibility, credibility, and change. So if we're thinking about how these sexual assault survivors are made invisible, then writing their stories thus makes them visible, and it basically gives a platform for those who, even though they're fictional, those experiences, those subject positions that are not often talked about in, or at least not until recently in young adult literature. So giving visibility, so that we can learn from them, so that we can recognize some of the harsh truths in our world. Also credibility, right? So allowing this story to be written gives the protagonist some form of credibility, right? Almost all of these novels are written in either a third-person omnipotent narration style or first person, and so that gives them credibility over their own lives and their own stories. And then hopefully, obviously, we want this to elicit some kind of change, some kind of understanding in sexual assault trauma, specifically in teenagers. All of these novels, the victims, the survivors are either children or they are teenagers. And so this is unfortunately something that our students are dealing with, and so this issue needs to be written about. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start off by noting that animals are virtually everywhere in fiction. Picture books, juvenile stories, young adult novels, even literary fiction for adults features animals as anything from living background material to the protagonist. That is not to say that every story includes animals or references to animals. Rather, animals are common and they're expected, so their existence is implicit. Even when animals don't appear directly, they're assumed to exist in the world by readers. And this is an important aspect of animal studies. Now, animal studies, we're not looking at animal representations per se, but how these representations reflect what it means to be human. So, animal studies tries to define what humans are through animal interactions, tries to determine the distinction between us and the other. It sets up these categories of the other, where you might have a hierarchy in place. Some others are better than some. And this has ethical approaches when we're talking about the rights of these others, so animal rights in general. And this, of course, includes post and transhumanism. And there's a significant link between other areas of story, race, sexuality, gender identities. Animal representations are unique in their ability to blend the needs of the narrative in ways that can be difficult with human characters. It allows animal figures to exist as extensively anthropomorphized or effectively invisible. The rodents in Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim are so anthropomorphized that the essential plot points of the story would remain fundamentally unchanged if the mice and rats were transformed into human characters. while the rats that appear in the Planet of Junior Brown are forgettable. They're little more than set pieces for the boys to play off of. The animals in Mrs. Frisbee are impossible to ignore because they're present throughout the novel. But the rats in Junior Brown occupy only this fleeting moment that's easy to forget. That brief appearance, however, really encapsulates the futility of the power struggle the boys prepare to face as the novel progresses. And despite the meaningful nature of the encounter and its alignment with the issues of invisibility and power imbalance, the rats are overlooked in scholarship. That is, the encounter itself becomes effectively visible. And it's this type of invisibility, both in stories and in scholarship, that this collection addresses. So when a thing is invisible, it is most often ignored or overlooked. Because of invisibility, the work or function of animals in young adult and juvenile fiction often goes unnoticed. A story which prominently features animal characters is normally not the focus of extensive scholarship, and the animals in more comprehensively explored works are not the subject of many critical papers. Thus, the body of scholarly literature related to animal studies in young adult and juvenile literature is limited. This collection gathers scholarship that focuses on how animals are used to address problematic or difficult issues, spanning different eras and subgenres. The exploration of privilege, identity, subjectivity, rights, sexuality, gender, race, class are opened up to readers in ways that might otherwise be emotionally inappropriate or representationally lewd. This is not to say that animals, even when they are represented profoundly anthropomorphized characters, are blank canvases. Animals exist within human cultures, and they bring into stories meaning that retains a large degree of universality. A rat character carries different connotations from a dog, and a Chihuahua will be received differently when juxtaposed with a German Shepherd. Further, biases regarding a particular type of animal will change based on cultural context. A monkey may be portrayed differently with unique cultural assumptions in a Chinese story versus an American story. Similarly, existing representations of a particular species may color other later representations. Renard, a fox character from beast fables of the Middle Ages, serves as an archetype for future fox characters through whatever positive or negative characteristics, maybe cleverness versus thievery and trickery. Works within this collection include animals of various kinds and different types of representations, positive and problematic characters, as well as anthropomorphic and natural animals. The articles selected for this collection demonstrate the depth and relevance of animal studies in contemporary young adult and juvenile literary scholarship, while the works represented in those articles point to the breadth of literature available for further study. Part 1 focuses on identity and subjectivity. The articles in this section are a sort of secondary introduction, because one of the key focuses of animal studies is on identity and subjectivity. They consider how animals are used to explore human issues of representation, feminism, and sexuality as key points. The articles in section 2 deal with representations of companion animals and how these representations lead to questions of equality. That's not just equality among humans, but also equality between humans and others. Part 3 looks more specifically at the way animals are used in literature to argue for social change or provide insight, and at some of the potential problems that this, from the otter-like rasa who occupy the valleys of Mars in C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, to the fields of filet mignon that grow in the meat farms of N.T. Anderson's Feed, to the meekly zoomorphized Crazy Kevin of Rita Williams Garcia's One Crazy Summer, animal representations of various forms twist and flow through our stories, often unnoticed or disregarded. This collection seeks to consolidate a small sample of animal study scholarship and shine light on the importance of animal representations in fiction. Thank you for your time.
Ooh. Thank you so much. Yeah, it would. And I actually reviewed a book several years ago on children's literature, or animals in children's literature. I can't remember what it said, and I think it was mostly British literature, and I think it was mostly like to the mid 20th century, maybe it went up that far, I don't remember. But so there's been some work done on, and one of my colleagues, when I was going to Illinois State University, did her dissertation on animals in children's and adolescent literature. I don't know if she ever did anything with that. All right, so look at us. We did it. We made it. I think I've got everybody. I didn't do Jamisa because I didn't know what to do with yours, Jamisa. But wow, you made it. Congratulations. Everybody, as far as I know, is still alive. So congratulations to you, and it's been a real pleasure again, as it always is with my graduate classes. I really enjoy them. And some of you I'll be seeing, and I put quotation marks around that, next semester or following semesters. Some of you will be walking right out of my life and graduating. Jolene.
I'm not walking out of your life. We have plans.
That's right, we do. And Alex, because you're going to...
I'm not graduating.
Oh, you're not?
No.
Are you taking...
I still have to do 595.
We're doing it together.
Oh, that's right. So, yeah, I'll see you guys next semester. And I'm revamping the course for that a little bit to overcome some obstacles I saw students facing. So it's been a pleasure. Keep in touch with me. And some of you, like I said, I'll see you again. And I know I'll see a great number in 599 because I'm over enrolled by 10. So goodbye, everybody. Streaming in. Goodbye. Wave to them. Yes, yes, yes. And next time, be well, be safe,